name is Gary LaFree. I'm a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland, where I also direct the START Center, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. It's my honor today to be able to stage this interview with Christopher Birkbeck, who, in addition to being someone who I've worked with in the past and have been a colleague with in the past, we've also been good friends for more than 30 years. So it's a real honor to be able to do this interview today. And this is totally unrehearsed, but I think we'll try to sort of go through Chris's history and record in terms of criminology, more or less chronologically, starting with sort of the origins of his interest in criminology and ending with perhaps more recent events. So maybe to kick things off, I would ask Chris to comment a little bit about how you got into the field of criminology to begin with.
Yeah, well, thank you, Gary. Thank you for that. It's really nice to be able to chat, and I'm sure I'll be asking you questions as well as we go forwards. I got into criminology because I met a person who, it turned out, was quite heavily involved in crime, and that person actually got very interested in the potential to research crime and became my access to criminality. That's the very short story. To expand on it, I was working as a research assistant in Colombia in South America, in the city of Cali, in southern Colombia, on a project run from the University of Wales, actually, University College Swansea, funded by the British government, to look at what in urban sociology and economics is called the informal sector, dealing with unregulated and particularly low-level enterprises, particularly among the poor, particularly making money on the street. Back in the 1970s, there was a lot of interest in that. And my first field project, based in Cali, was to look at people who pick through rubbish, or garbage as you call it in the United States, to collect it and sell it on for recycling. And so I was based at the main municipal garbage dump in Cali, tropical country, the heat, the garbage coming in, the flies, and lots of people picking through the rubbish. As I got into that job, I was doing observation and interviews, and I was there every day. Everybody was very nice to me. There was a chap who was older than me, small guy, who people respected, and he was there sometimes and he was there other times, but not all the time. Sometimes seemed to have a frown on his face. One time I remember he was there and he stood up on a whole load of sacks of paper that had been collected and just sang this impromptu song that was absolutely full of expletives. That's all it was, and everybody was laughing their heads off. And somebody finally said to me, his name was Chamon, his nickname, you should talk to Chamon about this, he can tell you about this. And so it was late one afternoon, sun going down, I approach him, somebody introduces me, very tentatively because my Spanish wasn't that good at that time, and it was incredible. He shook my hand, accepted my offer to go and have a drink of lemonade that they sold right there, and he started to talk with me about the recycling business. And what was interesting was that I'd been there for 3 weeks trying to piece together this, piece together that, and it was like you had somebody who was a sociologist there. He just said, these are the intermediary dealers, this is what they pay, they sell on to this company, these people specialize in bone collection, they specialize in this, some people are here all the time, I come sometimes and I don't others. And right from there you could tell that here was somebody who had the capacity to analyze and tell you about their local environment, which of course in observational or participant observation research, as it was called, is absolutely fantastic. So we got to know each other, and he helped me in that project, and then we actually proposed to employ him as a research assistant, which he happily accepted. And he'd heard that our project had a broad definition of the informal sector, and that included making money through crime, street crime in particular, And he said, I could help you with that one. Really? Could you, Chairman? Yeah, I could. And he gradually began to talk about his own involvement in crime. He had essentially history in burglary and in armed robbery. He also confessed later to having murdered somebody. And so we did a little bit during that project on that, and the first, it was absolutely amazing to be, again, taken through the centre of Carly, and he would say, see that little boy, he's got a rubber band and a paper clip. He's about to fire it at a lady so he can pull her handbag from her. Everywhere you'd go, he'd say, this guy buys stolen watches. This guy deals in pens, and so on and so forth. And so I thought about this and decided, I remember talking to colleagues at Swansea, my PhD project was initially on urban development and urban housing patterns, particularly, actually not so much amongst the poor, but amongst the middle class, and I was sort of working on that. Then I had this opportunity, somebody who's saying, I can tell you all about what's going on, and he wasn't the sort of person to sell it in a sensationalist way. You could verify everything that he was talking about. So I just made that decision. I'm changing my topic, which I did, and very fortunately, the university here, at Swansea, agreed to that change. I was able to get some money from the British government again for another 4 months to actually study exclusively crime and a little bit of criminal justice back in the city of Carly. And so that set me on the route to a PhD thesis in criminology. Yes, it was about crime in Colombia, but I had no training in criminology. I was a geographer, but then there wasn't much training around for criminologists at that time. So that was the late 70s, and that's really how I got started, yeah.
I've got to ask you a follow-up question about, did you keep in touch with Chamon?
Yes, I did. And then when I subsequently moved to Venezuela, I did. Unfortunately, it's tragic. He was from the black Colombian community. He'd been born in one of the poor towns, mainly people by blacks in the sugarcane areas south of Cali. So very much in the marginal settlements. And at some point during his life, he would have picked up the tuberculosis. So I remember in 1978, he wasn't feeling so good. He smoked as well, but he was coughing a lot, and I paid for him to go to the doctor. They came back, they said, you've got tuberculosis, and there's no cure for this, we can placate. And in 1981, only 3 or 4 years later, unfortunately, he died. So, but he recorded his experiences. I still have a copy of all of those transcripts. Yeah. And
so I take the point about, you got into this, into criminology kind of from a side route, but as I understand it, with a lot of emphasis on geography. Could you maybe comment about how, having an experience with geography has affected your career as a criminologist?
Yeah, maybe in 2 ways, and I can shut me up if I go on for too long on this. The first way was, I think, and simpler, geography at that time, and particularly human geography, was spreading its tentacles into all sorts of topics. I think it had an identity crisis, because I think some things that were published as geography really would have fit as sociology, anthropology, political science, or economics. And so I think geographers, I did geography at Oxford, I studied at Oxford, and they have a very strong program in human geography, and so quite a wide range of sources and approaches. I didn't feel uncomfortable about crossing disciplinary boundaries. So, I got an undergraduate degree in geography. I was hired as a research assistant for a project in the field of development studies, and that led to readings in urban sociology, economics, and also everything in demography around large cities in the so-called third world. And so I was already, sort of in parallel to going to Latin America, I was also crossing the boundaries into other disciplines, and I thought, hey, heck, I can read this stuff up, and I will. So that's that's one way in which geography took me into criminology. And then when I started to develop, the initial project was very much influenced by our perspective on informal economies, and it was about how income opportunities are structured and what the barriers are to escaping poverty. And it's that word opportunity that is important, because I was looking at criminal behaviour as an income opportunity and studying, not Chamon, he didn't commit crime when he was working on our projects, he never did, nor ever put me in a situation like that. But the people that we talked to and the information that we gathered, who are these guys, how do they make money, why don't they make more money out of crime, given that the likelihood of getting out of poverty in other ways is very difficult. And so I was thinking about how income opportunities are structured, and then in the early 80s, as you well know, the idea of opportunities for crime was coming around to, it was emerging and gathering a lot of attention in, I think particularly in US criminology with the routine activity theory, also the stuff in the UK, the Home Office research, Ron Clark's work on opportunities and crime. And so as one did those searches, opportunity and crime, that came in, and out of that came the situational perspective that you and I have worked on. And for somebody who's been trained to think about environments and space, that situational perspective, I think I felt very comfortable with it because I had studied human geography. But I could never say that I've done stuff in what's called the geography of crime or published about crime in geographical journals. So I think there was an influence, but no attempt to bring the two disciplines together.
Okay. So this gets you into Colombia, but as people listening to this may know, you've done a lot of work in Venezuela.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about how you got to Venezuela and how the earlier experiences there went?
Yes. I had been in Ecuador for a year prior to going to Colombia. I started to learn Spanish there. It wasn't that great when I got to Colombia. It got much better after that, and particularly Chamon was not only a good sociological researcher, but also a very good teacher of Spanish. And I fell in love with South America, with Latin America. After the first 15 months of field work there, I came back to the UK and I didn't feel as if I was in the right place. I was longing to go back somehow. And I thought, I've been to Ecuador, I've been to Colombia, Venezuela's the next country over. And so I was interested in going to Venezuela. Partly because of the stresses of researching crime in urban neighborhoods in Colombia. It could be a very stressful environment, and I knew that I would get extraordinarily stressed. I saw incidents of violence, I saw people who had been killed. I went in Colombia to the local prison. We went to it doesn't exist now, but the island prison of Gorgona in the Pacific Ocean. Real sort of papillon stuff there, and it was extraordinarily stressful. I thought, well, maybe I should go somewhere else and just disconnect from that. The other factor, though, was that in the late 70s and early 80s, Venezuela was going through an oil boom, and its criminology was, I would say, probably the best developed in Latin America. So there was interest in going to Venezuela for that reason as well. There was a romantic interest as well, but that's probably of less interest to
or maybe more
to a conversation like this. And actually, again, it's about decisions and courses and life-wise. I actually took 2 CVs to look for a job in Venezuela. One as a geographer, one as a criminologist, and after 2 or 3 months there, I'd begun to get to know a few Venezuelan criminologists, and so from the University of the Andes, Universidad de los Andes in Mérida in Venezuela, they said, we'd like to meet you, and they looked at my CV, and my good friend and colleague Luis Gerardo Gabaldon from that university said, we'd like you to come to work with the Universidad de los Andes. He talked to his dean. universities at that stage were just getting money. It was falling out of the sky. They had so much money, it was easy to create contracts. They did. I remember, Ryan Smile, I remember sort of very valiantly saying to the dean, I'm willing to stay for 2 years in Venezuela. Little did I know that it would end up as 26 working for them. So yes, I actually was able to get a job as a criminology teacher and researcher at a Venezuelan university, much as I would have done here or you did in the United States. And so my career developed there. But if a geography department had said, we want you as a geographer, then I might have gone back into geography. We wouldn't be here today.
The role of serendipity.
The role of serendipity.
So one of the ways that you've been a research pioneer in criminology is by doing victimization surveys in Latin America. And I believe, as far as I know, you were the first. Could you talk a little bit about what drew you to doing a victimization survey and got you into that area of research?
Yeah, I'm not the first. There were Latin American criminologists in Panama who had done a small victimology survey before that, and actually a big organization in Colombia that it represented the finance institutions. They did a lot of research. They had done a small victim survey, but there wasn't much going on at that stage. And for the 4-month study on crime and low-income neighborhoods in Colombia that was financed from the UK and involved fieldwork back in Cali in Colombia, I proposed to use mixed methods. We'd had previous experience with the Colombian Census Office, who'd done a household survey for us for the informal sector project. So we had contacts and a way to organise a well-organised household survey. And in my reading about crime and criminology, very quickly I came across the idea of the victim survey, and I thought this would be very important in terms of looking at the impact of crime across households, how many people were victimised, and this fit in also with the idea of the income opportunities for low-income offenders in particular. Where were they committing their crimes? Was it, as I suspected from the observational side of things, the ethnographic accounts, they were mainly going into other poor neighbourhoods and not into the wealthier areas of the city. And frankly, I can't remember much more about how and why I decided to do it, but we designed the victim survey. It was conducted by the Colombian Census Office and very professionally. And so yes, it became probably the first large sample from a city in Latin America, and then things moved on quite quickly after that. I used victim surveys again in 1981, 1985. You and I did in 1987 in Venezuela, and through different routes, not because people were looking at my research necessarily. Other colleagues in Latin America were hearing about victim surveys, and particularly from the 1990s onwards, you've had victim surveys that are as frequent, I think, in many Latin American countries as they are here in Europe.
Mm-hmm. So given this long perspective of working in Latin America, could you comment a little bit about some of the differences you see between criminology in Venezuela and maybe more broadly Latin America versus Europe and the United States?
Yes. It's hard to keep up with everything that's going on in relation to studies of crime and criminal justice. In Latin America, there is so much happening now, but I think I would still be accurate in characterizing the interest in crime and criminal justice as coming from two different disciplinary backgrounds and environments. The longest standing one was from law, and among criminal lawyers in particular. There was a fairly long tradition of people studying, graduating in law, and then, for example, going to the University of Rome or going to the University of Louvain, I think, in Belgium. Those were the two places that from Venezuela they were going to get a master's or doctorate in criminology. So criminology was an outgrowth of an interest in criminal law and had a very strong legalistic sort of foundation. And then Latin America connected particularly with the developments in critical criminology, both in Europe and in North America. And this was in the 70s to 80s again with the National Deviancy Conference here in the UK, the Critical Criminology group at Berkeley in the US. And so you had very strong development of something like a critical criminology or a critical criminal law group. And I think that tradition is still ongoing and leads to quite a lot of critical work on criminal justice and social control in Latin America, and less interest in the crime itself. From the other perspective, as crime rates skyrocketed, particularly in certain parts of Latin America from the early 1990s onwards, this became a topic of concern, not just for the countries themselves, but also for international development agencies like the Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank. And they began to fund studies about rates of crime, rates of violence, and crime prevention and violence prevention. And most of the researchers who moved into those fields came from, not from law, but from sociology, some from psychology, and usually without any particular formal training in criminology. And they didn't brand their work necessarily as criminological either. So their work is very much more focused within sorts of epidemiologies of violence and risk factors for violence and explanations for high rates of violence, and then in relation to that, peacemaking and conflict resolution. And so those are the two strongest trends in Latin American criminology. What we did in the University of the Andes, and initially was criticized a lot, we were very much interested in quantitative research, the idea of the victim survey, and subsequently systematic observation of the police and surveys with police. This was labelled as positivist criminology, and particularly among the critical lawyers, positivist criminology had a very bad name. And so I remember the odd comment outside of print and the occasional comment in print that rather attacked what we were doing and what I was doing. And I think because I'm British, I was seen as sort of the who's this person from Europe who's bringing in this positivist emphasis and this quantitative emphasis. Those working on violence and crime rates now have established that quantitative research is important both for understanding and for policy, but they're not as highly connected to the debates in criminology. So we were in a sort of rather unique position there, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And things have certainly continued to evolve in Latin America since your Venezuela period. Where would you say, how do you see the situation with regard to criminology now in Latin America? Because I know you still have lots of connections to Latin America.
Yeah, I think it's very fragmented. I saw that there were attempts, even from the early 70s, to develop Latin American forums for criminology. I think the ASC, American Society of Criminology, actually hosted a meeting in Caracas in 1971.
Indeed it did, yeah.
With the hope of getting something going in Latin America, and that didn't work. Yes. There have been initiatives to bring together working groups, particularly again from Venezuela. Lolita Anillar de Castro, who's unfortunately now passed away, brought together people from across the region, researchers, to work firstly on white-collar crime and then critical visions of social control. Initially with some support from the University of Montreal and then independently. But those initiatives depend, they're only as vibrant as actually the money that's available to support them. There have been attempts more recently. My colleague Alfonso Serrano from Madrid was in contact with scholars in Peru. They were trying to develop a Latin American initiative, and that one didn't get going either. So you get the sense of this fragmentation. There are groups, and strong groups, working in Mexico, in Brazil, Argentina in particular. Used to be a really strong group in Venezuela, but the economic and political situation of Venezuela means that there's little activity going on now. And I think a lot of it has to do with the difficulties of maintaining scholarship and scholarly activity. These are not research-intensive countries, they're not wealthy countries, and so in some countries your university job is the third job you have, and you don't get paid much for it. Particularly the criminology teachers, they used to go to the courts in the morning, to their law office in the afternoon, and then at 6 o'clock they go in and teach criminal law. How can you expect them to have time to research, and where are they going to get the money to go to scientific meetings? And there has been an increased offer and consciousness on the part of national governments and some universities that money needs to be and is being made available to support scholars to travel nationally and internationally, but it's certainly, I don't think, as available as it is here. And for most criminologists in Europe, for example, where we are today, not everybody needs financial support, particularly in the UK, to get to the University of Cardiff to this meeting. The cost of the conference is what it is, and people can absorb that. But those sorts of costs are unthinkable for people who are interested in criminology in many parts of Latin America. And so I think that's one of the big challenges to bringing together Latin American criminology.
So, following your long career in Venezuela, while it was going on, you also spent some time at the University of New Mexico.
Yeah, thanks to you. Yeah.
Indeed. So, could you talk a little bit about that? Did you sort of see that part of your career as a bit of a continuation of the work in Latin America, or was it a bit different in some ways?
No, I think definitely a continuation for two reasons. One is that it was where we were able to work on the situational perspective in relation to crime and continue to develop comparative perspective. It was an extraordinarily good opportunity to get to know US criminology, which is still the strongest core of development of criminology in the world. Most research, most teaching, and very heavy influence on criminology elsewhere. So it was a continuation, yeah, and I think it allowed me something that again, I was very fortunate to be able to do that, because if you are based in Latin America, not only do you have the challenge of finding funding to go to meetings, to go and meet people and things like that, to network. Also, it was and still is the case that for Latin American universities, library collections and subscription to the big international journals is prohibitively expensive. It's got a bit better, but only a few elite institutions still have that access. So if you're trying to develop criminology that has a cross-national flavour to it, it's very hard to do it and to talk to colleagues internationally if you are not able to get access to much of the literature that they're reading. So that's one reason why it was good to be there. And every time I visited, I was always in the library making photocopies back then, because that's what you did, and photocopies back to Venezuela because you couldn't get that stuff there. But also to understand a lot more about the nature of criminology in the United States, criminology within the American Society of Criminology, the strong emphasis on theory, on quantitative methods. And I know you've been a voice for challenging the what was considered to be at some point a sort of parochialism potentially inherent in some of the criminological scholarship in the United States. And so it was interesting to see the way in which the discourse was framed when people would give papers and write out and what they're familiar with, or are they also thinking about other kinds of context and environment. So I think it added a lot. And I've always been very happy to have had that experience, very grateful for the opportunity.
So in some ways your career most recently has kind of come full circle, and you returned to the UK and moved back to Manchester, or moved to Manchester.
Yeah.
Could you perhaps talk a little bit about this stage of your career?
Yeah. I think I'll just say before that I feel, again, extraordinarily lucky to have been able to work as a regular member of staff in South America, in the United States, and here in the United Kingdom. It's very different to being a tourist.
Yes.
In each of those locations, and it's been
and that's probably a pretty rare thing to be able to claim, isn't it?
It may well be.
Yeah.
I always remember when I was leaving the University College of Swansea, I'd said that there was some interest in me maybe trying to stay on, and they thought I might be able to apply for a lectureship there, and did I want to? And I said, no, I want to go back to South America. And a senior member of staff who was close to retirement then, he said, make sure if you leave now that you're back by the time you're 30. That was 3 years hence, you know. I said, why? He said, I think it was because salaries at that time in the UK were partly based on age and experience. They're not now if you're going into an institution. He said you'll be too expensive to hire after that. And I always carried that with me, actually, because I thought, oh heck, if I do want to relocate, how am I going to do it? Circumstances came together such that 11 years ago, having done 26 years in Venezuela, we wanted to relocate actually as a family, and particularly for our sons to go to university. They said they wanted to go to university internationally, and so I started sending out applications. And back here in the UK is, you know, fairly easy for a British citizen because you don't have to deal with the problems of visas and immigration. I wish it was the same for everybody. And I had a very strange curriculum vitae, I think. More than half my publications were in Spanish. To be honest, if you're in Latin America, you are on the margins of international criminology, I think. You just cannot network and stay in touch and do the same things that you would do if you are based fully and permanently in a research-intensive country. So, you know, they could look at this and say, how much did he bring in research money over the last 20 years? Because if you convert the Venezuelan currency to, you know, to dollars, it's not much. Those sorts of things. At the University of Salford was looking for someone. They, I think, were able to understand what my CV was about, and they offered me a job, and that's where I'm. And the University of Salford is in Manchester, and that's where I'm based now. So, essentially doing the same. Teaching criminology, researching criminology, but now doing it more in English than in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're here through an invitation of the European Society of Criminology. Could you talk a little bit about how you got involved in the ESC and sort of developments that have had some effect on you from the ESC?
Yes. I first heard about the ESC, I think, through the executive secretary of the ASC, Chris Eskridge, and he was talking about this new development here at the European Society of Criminology. I was in Venezuela at the time, and if I remember correctly, there was a joint meeting in Paris where the American Society of Criminology and the fledgling European Society of Criminology came together, and I attended from Venezuela and thought this looked very interesting, and I was attracted by particularly by the fact that there was participation from Spain, and I already knew some researchers from Spain, and I thought this is a good way to keep in touch with developments in Europe. And so yeah, over the years I have maintained contact with the European Society of Criminology. I love the fact that it is so international, and that it is not just restricted to Europe either, it's open. So it is, very much a very vibrant, functioning international society of criminology, which plays a significant role above and beyond what the national societies are doing. And for me in particular, it's been really good because when I was still in Venezuela, I heard about the international project called the International Self-Report Survey on Delinquency that was proposed, initiated and set up really by Josine Younger-Tas from the Netherlands, and the ISRD project, as it's known, began in the early 90s. The second sweep was going on in 2005. I proposed from Venezuela that Venezuela could be involved, and they said yes. And then Venezuela also has participated in the third sweep, which is now coming to a close. And that working group has been a really, really interesting group of colleagues to be involved with, and it has managed. It's like a collaborative, really, because the funding is, every country funds itself, but it has been able to grow and develop, partly because many of the people who are involved in the project are also members of the ESC, and so for example, this year's meetings here in Cardiff, there are 6 panels devoted to the ISRD, and it's a chance to meet with other members to talk to the steering committee. And I think it's a wonderful forum for thinking about the challenges and the benefits of cross-national comparative research, which is an area that I've always been interested in. And so for me, when I think ESC, I'm also thinking ISRD, and how the two, I think, they've sort of grown together and they contribute to each other. So, yeah.
So you've clearly kept this long-standing interest in victimization surveys. Could you describe, perhaps in a little more detail, if there are differences in your current research interests compared to, say, your Venezuela period?
Yeah. The first 10 years or so in Venezuela were really around the opportunity theories for crime and the situational perspective on crime. Came to a close really by the early 1990s, and then Venezuelan colleagues were really interested in the problem of the use of force by the police in Venezuela. Across Latin America there are horrendous problems with police abuse of force, and so we then set up a local project to begin to explore use of force by the police and determinants of the use of force by the police, and that started in the mid-90s, and in the early 2000s we were able to get funding and bring together colleagues from a number of countries around the world: Canada, I think the US at one point, Germany, South Africa, Australia, South Africa, no, the UK, and so we set up an international project on the use of force by the police, and looked particularly at the way in which officers themselves understood and accounted for their use of force, and the way in which those accounts might then generate uses of force in future engagements. And so that line of research then took up about those 10 years, and then for the last 10 to 12 years what has grown up has been this research on youth crime and delinquency and theories of crime through the ISRD project. But I think my interests probably are best summarised right now on the one hand substantively in terms of looking at the moral dimension either of crime or reactions to crime or commentary about crime. So I wrote a monograph about the way in which the public sector through the newspapers, the public domain, moralizes about crime across the Americas, and looking at the way in which crime is used to strengthen a sense of civil society. It was some very problematic frameworks in relation to criminals and others, and the very narrow and shallow labels given to offenders. And that project led me into an interest in truth commissions and what victims say when they go to a truth commission. I haven't had a chance to publish anything on that yet, but then it led to a current project on restorative justice, which a colleague and I, Greg Smith and I from Salford, have got funding to do. And we are, right now, we're recording restorative justice conferences. Tough to do because they're very sensitive events and spaces, but we're actually, very few exceptions, nobody has been recording this kind of a restorative justice conversation. And we're actually, we're going to be looking at what people say to each other and the turning points within restorative justice conferences, shifts in footing, and I'm particularly interested in the moral frameworks that they bring to it, so that's one area. And out of the ISRD stuff comes an interest in morality and crime, situational action theory, developed by P.O. Wickstrom at Cambridge, is a theory that's caught my attention. I'm supervising some research from Saudi Arabia on that topic. A colleague in Venezuela's working on it. And we've also been developing some methodological interests around the ISRD, the need to remove inbuilt sort of cultural assumptions that go into surveys, broaden the focus so that things are understood in the same way in different places. But I could go on and on about the number of things I'd like to do. So yes, my interests have changed over the years, as I think most people's have. I know yours have as well. Yeah.
So I didn't know about the Saudi Arabia project. Can you say a little more about?
Well, yes, we have a doctoral student from Saudi Arabia, from the Princess Noura University in Riyadh. She's doing her doctorate with us at Salford, and she's very interested in theories of criminality, and she was starting when situational action theory was really beginning to make an impact a couple of years ago. And so she has translated the items into Arabic, and she was able, after a long struggle, to get permission to conduct the survey in the city of Riyadh. And she's now in the process of analysing and writing up the data. So it will be directly comparable with data collected in Venezuela as well. So we will be able to publish another study that actually looks at situational action theory in cultural and political environments that are very different to the environment that saw the theory grow and where it's mainly been tested.
I'd certainly think that will be the first study comparing Saudi Arabia and Venezuela.
Yeah, I love it. You know, the chance to be able to do it
is very interesting.
Yeah.
So you've been referring throughout our conversation so far to some of the researchers and research that's influenced you the most. Could you sort of talk a little bit more about that? About some of the research theories and some of the writings in criminology that have had the biggest impact on your own career?
Oh, yeah. I think I most quickly and easily point to Jack Katz and The Seductions of Crime. I know it's now been out for a long time, but I found that book so striking in terms of its approach and its attempt to understand, the foreground of criminal behaviour, that I think it's always been a really strong influence on me in terms of thinking beyond and behind quantitative questionnaire-based research, and beyond and behind ethnographic accounts, and also, of course, thinking about the moral and moralistic elements in crime and in offending, and thinking about how victims and offenders come together and talk. Although, where would you see that particular influence in my work? It's hard to pinpoint and say that is specifically influenced by that person. I have learned an awful lot from you. And I'm not just saying that because you're here, but I'm very familiar with your work. Less so, I have to confess, some of the more recent work, because you're publishing so much I can't keep up with it. But the approach to quantitative research and to theory in particular you take, I've always read that, and you're sort of in the back of my mind as I'm writing things and thinking, how might other people see this? I think all of the good, clear writers in criminology are just, you read them and you think, yeah, I need to be like that. I picked up the other day a reissue of Travis Hirsch's Causes of Crime.
Yeah. It's remarkably well written, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was looking at his most recent preface. I know tragically passed away now, but I think this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, about an update on the update. It is just so well written, so clear. You think, no wonder this guy is so widely cited and has been so influential. And as it's not so much about maybe following the ideas as just following the approach and having the clarity, the incisiveness, the nuance to be able to pick your way through things and see what's important and what's not important.
Right.
Yeah.
So, as someone who's been in the field of criminology for, I guess, at least several decades now, could you comment a little bit about, where you think the field is heading, and perhaps where you think the field should be heading in the next period?
Yeah, it's a very disparate field. I'm not saying anything new there, and you can see it in the conference programs, both for national and international conferences. I do worry a little bit that it is beginning to fragment, and that somehow work is going on. I don't think the idea of a paradigm is exactly applicable to a discipline like criminology, but my reading of him is correct. He talked about normal science that, without belittling it too much, kind of tinkers at the margins within frameworks that are fairly well established. And it's a little bit like you throw a rock into a pool and a wave goes out, and more and more studies develop, and particularly with the advance in quantitative techniques for measurement and analysis, the multidimensionality of our variables mean that you can generate so many different kinds of analysis and so many different kinds of interpretation that there's always the possibility to do one more study. And then there's the difficulty of pulling all of that together and asking ourselves, well, is this really what we want to do? Are we moving forward, or are we just moving sideways? So that's not saying where I think criminology is going. I'm just slightly worried about the expansion of the discipline and the tendency to create more at the margins, and maybe the difficulty of moving forwards in ways that are important. I suspect that something I don't know, I haven't been so in touch with things in the US and North America recently, but I suspect that interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, the different ways of approaching this, approaches to the phenomena of crime, reactions to crime, criminal justice will become increasingly important and that they will enrich our perspectives on what's going on, and, as it were, give criminology the chance to tell other disciplines and influence what's going on in other disciplines. But also that will enrich criminology and criminological thinking. But predicting where it's going is a really tough one. I think maybe the people who are thinking about criminology at the broad level, the David Garlands, the Richard Sparks, would have a better sense of where it might be headed.
So in a career that has spanned 3 very different parts of the world, looking back at it, are there some things that you're particularly proud of, in your research, that you see as achievements in particular that you could comment on?
I think my contributions have been modest, but hopefully important. Certainly I don't think I'm a key figure in any particular area or field, but that doesn't bother me. I'm interested in what I'm doing. At a real local level in Venezuela, I was heavily involved. This isn't research, this is teaching, in setting up the first program undergraduate level in criminology. We did all of the planning in 1981 and 1982. We had a lot of international support. Even Stan Cohen wrote a course outline for us. It was very kind of him. And that school got going in 1992, and that was the second program in criminology in the Latin American continent. They've proliferated since then. And that was an interesting achievement. In Venezuela, I found, and this is when you're in a country that is not research intensive, that everywhere you looked there was something that was interesting and nobody had done it. And so, for example, in the later years there, I did a lot of work with students on offenders and sentencing and tracking offenders through sentencing. Nobody had ever looked at early release measures, almost nobody had looked at probation, those kinds of things. Wherever you looked, there it was. Contributing to the work on the police use of force, those sorts of things I'm very proud of. What I think I'm most satisfied with is the chance to use that international experience to be aware always of the crucial importance of cross-cultural differences which affect the questions you ask, the way you might want to measure and respond to them, but also the ability to talk across linguistic barriers and actually academic cultural barriers. The style of criminology in Latin America is different to that in the US or Europe. Things can get easily lost in translation, and they may be going in different ways. I've always felt as if I've been able to bridge the 2 worlds or the 3 worlds. So I can understand, if I'm asked to review an article for a journal like Criminology, I can imagine the audience and know what they're looking for. And if I'm asked to review for an article, for example, for Capítulo Criminológico, which is one of the Venezuelan journals, I know what kind of audience they're looking for, and similarly here. And I think in the ISRD project, on the reverse side, I've been able to keep awareness around the fact that if you sit in Western Europe and North America and design a survey, you build in a whole set of assumptions about what there is in the rest of the world and how the school system works and how people understand things. And no, it may not. It's not as simple as that.
Yeah.
So that's a messy answer to your question, but
yeah. So in the course of discussing these issues, it strikes me that on the one hand, some of the things you're saying might suggest that different parts of the world, with regard to criminology, are coming a little closer together, maybe some sort of globalization, but then also you've expressed concerns about fragmentation. So you have a kind of a unique perspective in that you've had not just a foot in, but a serious career in Latin America, in the UK, in the United States, and very close relations with Europe. So how do you see criminology going? Are we getting closer to a kind of international criminology, or are we fragmenting more than even when you started your career?
No, I think the fragmentation is in terms of content and substance, not in terms of networks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the international networks are developing and strengthening. You see that at an event like this, you'll see that, I'm sure, at the ASC. I haven't been to a meeting of theirs for a while. And you see it in the international initiatives. And so I think there is a growing internationalization from the Latin American perspective. For a long time, I found that there wasn't a great deal of familiarity or comfort with talking in English and access to literature in English, which makes a huge challenge to incorporating or developing a dialogue across, from Latin America to the international community, which works in English. Now, for example, almost all of those who work on the epidemiology of violence and work on violence prevention in Latin America are bilingual or almost bilingual. They can talk across boundaries about these things. And so increasingly and pleasingly, you're seeing, at least from Latin America, I think there are still other regions of the world which are greatly underrepresented in international discourse. They're coming in and they're talking. I think the international community of criminology is still inevitably very heavily influenced by the research-intensive countries in North America and in Europe in terms of the standards, the expectations, editorial guidelines, criteria for funding. But I think there's also some diversity, which is very good, and which allows and disciplinary diversity as well. So, critical criminology, for example, Latin Americans would tend to go to that, so you wouldn't necessarily see them at the latest test with multivariate analysis of the latest theory using multi-level modeling, structural equations, and so on and so forth. Their eyes might glaze over because they're not interested in that, but they segmentally will interact with the international initiatives. So, yeah, I think international networks are growing. I think the whole question is, do we have a discipline in the sense of a subject matter that's moving somewhere that looks interesting?
And related to that, I know there's been ongoing discussion for decades about this, but do we need a Latin American criminology? Or is that separate from criminology more generally?
No, what we need is a Latin American point of view. I've thought about this a lot, and I've written a bit about it. There was a time when Latin American criminologists said we need a Latin American criminology, and I took issue with them and said no, we don't, although I wasn't clear quite how to argue it out. But I came to the conclusion, and it's a simple conclusion, but it took me a long time to get there, typical me, that theories in criminology, particularly undertaken in the positivist dimension, seek generality, and I subscribe to that. We can't have the relation of theory to territory is extraordinarily problematic, and I think we need to aspire to generality, and I will push for that. And it's not surprising that when you look at theories that were developed, for example, in the United States, you often find quite a lot of support for them among samples of comparable people in Latin America, which directly defies or contradicts the earliest notions among some radical Latin American criminologists that what was developed in the North was not applicable in the South. Yeah, it's applicable and it will give you similar results. I think the more interesting question is, but the person who developed the theory in the United States was thinking about the United States. They weren't thinking about other parts of the world. So they may see things in a particular way, and again, to mention Travis Hershey, when he writes The Causes of Crime, I don't know if Travis Hershey travelled very much, but one pretty much can see, you know, he's very familiar with the US school system, US delinquency gangs, all of the work that was going on. He's not very familiar with any other things, and he's also representing his culture, which has a great interest in control and bonding and those sorts of things. Now, if you approach things from a Latin American perspective, other things might become more important. So in the 1970s, Latin Americans, sociologists in particular, and some people working on development, were interested in the concept of urban marginality, which wasn't as strongly developed in the US or Europe. We didn't talk about marginal populations, but actually marginality at that structural level has some, I think, some strong parallels with the idea of strong and weak bonds to conventional society. So my point is that if you take that concept of marginality, which was developed in some detail by particularly Argentinian sociologists and social scientists, what they've seen is marginality, and then you might say, now, could we apply the same concept to industrialized cities? So in other words, what becomes evident to the Latin American viewpoint shouldn't be specific to them either. It should be applicable across the board. And in fact, to go back to the notion of the informal sector that took me to Cali, Colombia, where we started, that was developed by Keith Hart, a British sociologist or anthropologist working in Ghana. And so all of the early work on the informal economy was done in the so-called developing economies. And yet by the 1990s, sociologists in the UK were using the concept of informal economy to understand what was going on in cities like Cardiff, where we are today. And so the insight emerged in one place, but if it's going to be useful if it's general. And so I think the Latin American perspective is to say, well, how would a Latin American see this, and what issues come to the fore in Latin America that the local context and the local intellectual climate has to be included, but particularly the local context brings these things to the fore. And they say, interesting, now might there be insights from that can be applied elsewhere, internationally in criminology? See, does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah,
it does.
So that's my answer. It took me a long time to get there, but that's how I saw that.
So we are just about out of time here, but I wanted to end with one last question.
I thought you were going to tell a story.
Well, I'm sure we will have some people watching this that are interested in getting into criminology, particularly perhaps doing something in Latin America. And I wonder if perhaps you have any advice for someone who's listening to this, say they want to do research in Latin America.
Again, let's go back to serendipity. Why did I go to Latin America? Because when I was finishing my studies in geography at the University of Oxford and wondering what to do, I thought I wanted to do a doctorate, and I thought I wanted to study problems of development in poorer countries. And one of my supervisors or tutors was a PhD student, a doctoral candidate, John Jones. I've lost contact with him, who invited me for coffee once. I went to his house, and for half an hour we had a chat, and I said, I'm interested in my PhD on problems of urban development in poorer countries. How do I do it? And he said, well, first you've got to go and look. And in fact, my tutor at Oxford, Isabel Cosgrove, she said, you ought, and this is a geographic thing, go and look before you even think about what the project is. And I remember saying to John Jones, Isabel said, go and look, but where do I go? And he said, well, you can pick any country in the world. He said, and I said, well, why? He said, because you can support yourself teaching English if it's, and if it's a country that speaks English, you get a job. Just go and get a job for a year. And I said, yeah, okay. And in my mind at that point, I still remember this, in my mind at that point were two possibilities, Ethiopia or Ecuador. And I said to him, I'm going to go to Ecuador. And that's what I did. And I went to Ecuador and lived there for a year teaching English. Doesn't help you to learn Spanish if you teach English. And that gave me huge insights into Latin American cities, and also led me to think about, did I really want to do this or not? It was a tough year in some ways. It was the second year in Colombia that was perhaps more important, where I really got into the field research on the informal sector, which I'm on. So one piece of advice to anybody who's thinking about doing research on crime criminology, and there are many now, particularly quite a few from the UK have done it, and some really interesting stuff. But for those thinking about getting into it, go and have a look first. Go and see what you think you're going to study. In terms of working as a criminologist in Latin America, that's a tough one, because it's very hard to get a job teaching, or a job that will pay you, to live full time as a teacher in criminology. I was very, very lucky, because I went to Venezuela during a sort of 8-year window of absolute wealth for the public sector, and they could easily hire somebody like me. It was no difficulty for them to do that. These days, resources are much, much more constrained, competition is very high, and networks are very important. A foreigner who's not connected is unlikely to get much access, because of the way in which networks are used to organise income for friends, family, and so on and so forth. So and to read a lot of the good stuff that's being written by anthropologists, criminologists, sociologists about crime, violence, and police in Latin America. There's loads to be researched. I found everything you look at, there's stuff to do. And also, access is easier in Latin America for most things than it is in the research-intensive countries. Mm-hmm. So we found this in the ISRD, which goes into schools to hand out surveys to students. It's almost impossible to get into the schools in the United States.
Absolutely.
I'm hearing, Michael Gottfriedson, they're telling him no. If they're telling Michael Gottfriedson you can't get access, who can? In a country like Venezuela, you go to the local Ministry of Education, they'll say yes, you go to the schools, much, much easier. Prisons are open for public visits twice a week, so you can actually get in to visit without much difficulty, and the access to information is much greater. So there's a rich fields of potential data. You've got to be careful. Some dangerous things too, there's no doubt, particularly in countries with high rates of violence. But even in those countries, I've seen recent research where people have gone and studied violent neighbourhoods, and they've been able to work. I mean, I was with people in violent neighbourhoods in Colombia in the 70s, and what I found was that they understood the researcher. They thought the research was rather strange and interesting, and generally they weren't wanting to pick a fight with you. And if you were among people who knew you and you were with people who were known, you were generally not at risk.
Mm-hmm. So. Okay, well, this is great. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. I've actually learned a lot of things
really?
I didn't know.
Oh, okay.
I just want to thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for asking questions and tolerating my lengthy responses.
Very enjoyable.
I hope it's been interesting.
Okay.
Good.